A standard traffic stop, 90 seconds, perhaps fewer. No excessive speed, no dangerous maneuvering, nothing that would ordinarily trigger any suspicion. Curious, and still, by the time it concluded, that motorist left without driving privileges for the following 6 months. Not because they engaged in hazardous conduct, but because they violated a regulation that hadn't even been enacted 3 weeks before. Size. That's the element nobody anticipates. The regulations didn't merely update, they transformed beneath individuals in real time. And currently, there's one particular statute, number 3 on this countdown, that's already produced more than 12,000 tickets throughout the nation, with an average penalty approaching $500. The majority of those motorists had zero awareness they were committing any infraction, which presents a larger concern if the enforcement apparatus can identify that many individuals that rapidly. How many additional people are operating vehicles today entirely vulnerable without recognizing it? Because these aren't minor modifications. This isn't about traveling a few miles beyond the posted limit or gliding through a stop sign. These are foundational alterations to how you're permitted to operate, where you can position items within your vehicle, how your automobile is tracked, and in certain instances, whether your automobile will even permit you to operate at all. And the most alarming element is you can maintain every practice you've developed over the previous 10, 20, even 30 years and still be violating the law the instant you enter the roadway. So before you presume you're compliant, there's something you need to examine because the tolerance for mistakes in 2026 is essentially non-existent. Considerable time has been dedicated to monitoring how traffic regulations develop, not merely what modifications appear in writing, but how those modifications are actually being implemented against real motorists like yourself. And what transpired at the beginning of 2026 isn't ordinary. This represents the most significant transformation in traffic regulations we've witnessed in over a decade. Complete states deployed new enforcement frameworks, redefined what qualifies as an infraction, and in certain instances launched technology that's observing your actions in ways most individuals don't even comprehend yet. So, if you've been operating like it's still 2025, there's a very genuine possibility you're already non-compliant without awareness. And that's precisely how individuals are getting identified. Responsible motorists, attentive motorists, individuals who've never experienced difficulties before suddenly receiving penalties, points, or more severe consequences. What this presentation will accomplish is guide you through all 10 of these recent regulations, beginning from the ones that appear insignificant but are identifying thousands of individuals all the way to the top 3 that are producing the most substantial financial and legal consequences currently. And more critically, it will demonstrate exactly what you need to modify beginning today so you don't become one of those figures. Because once you observe how these are being implemented, you'll comprehend why so many motorists are getting caught unaware and why the following one on this countdown is already costing individuals hundreds of dollars over something that previously was entirely acceptable. For years, there existed an unwritten agreement between motorists and the roadway itself. That fleeting instant when a signal turns yellow, you possess just sufficient time to traverse the intersection. Not any longer. In 2026, that allowance has been entirely eliminated. 14 states have now linked high-resolution enforcement cameras directly with traffic signal frameworks down to the precise millisecond the signal turns red. Previously, numerous of these frameworks permitted a slight buffer, roughly half a second, providing motorists a practical opportunity to traverse safely. That buffer has vanished. Currently, if your rear tires are even marginally behind the boundary when the signal changes, the framework automatically registers a violation. No advisory, no judgment call, no officer to clarify your circumstances to, merely a ticket produced instantaneously. And here's where it becomes more intense. These cameras aren't assessing whether you traveled safely through the intersection. They're calculating position with extreme accuracy. Your front end either crossed in time or it didn't. That's everything that counts. In states like Florida and New York, these infractions aren't merely penalties anymore. They're being transmitted directly to insurance carriers. One error at the incorrect intersection could quietly expense you far more in premium escalations over the coming years than the ticket itself. What renders this particularly hazardous is how instinctive the previous practice still feels. You observe yellow, you estimate distance, you proceed. But that reflex now operates against you. The framework is no longer constructed around human assessment. It's constructed around precise timing, which means the most secure action isn't to proceed through, it's to halt every time. Because when the tolerance for mistakes falls to zero, even a flawless motorist can get identified doing what previously was entirely acceptable. And what's approaching next applies that identical zero-tolerance philosophy and implements it within your vehicle. You've likely encountered don't text and operate more occasions than you can remember. But in 2026, that regulation has transformed into something considerably more rigid and considerably simpler to breach without recognizing it. Multiple states, including California, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, have now transitioned to what's designated primary enforcement for device interaction, which means an officer, or more commonly now, an automated framework, doesn't require any additional justification to cite you. If a phone is in your grasp while your automobile is on a public roadway, that alone is adequate. And certainly, that encompasses when you're motionless. Red signal, traffic congestion, drive-through, it's irrelevant. If the engine is running and you're within the roadway setting, gripping your phone is now an infraction. What's surprising individuals is how this is being implemented. AI-supported cameras positioned on overpasses and enforcement vehicles can now identify when a motorist is gripping a device, even momentarily. You don't need to be messaging. You don't need to be browsing. Simply gripping it is adequate. One rapid look downward to switch a track or review a notification, and you've already violated the boundary. The penalties alone are aggravating, but the more significant concern is what transpires afterward. If you're involved in a collision and there's proof your phone was in your grasp, even if you weren't responsible, insurance carriers now possess greater leverage to contend that you contributed to the circumstances. And that can result in diminished settlements or rejected claims entirely. But here's where it becomes even more exact, and where thousands of motorists are getting identified without comprehending it. Even if your phone isn't in your grasp, even if you believe you're doing everything correctly by utilizing a mount, the precise positioning of that phone within your vehicle is now controlled in methods that didn't exist previously. And what previously made you compliant might currently be placing you in jeopardy. Up until recently, utilizing a phone mount seemed like the conscientious approach. Maintain your hands available, maintain your gaze forward, observe the regulations. And for an extended period, that sufficed. But in 2026, that identical arrangement could currently be the precise reason you receive a citation or, more seriously, forfeit money in a circumstance you didn't even create. 17 states have enacted specific positioning regulations that prescribe exactly where your phone is permitted to rest within your automobile. Not broadly, not vaguely, but exactly. And the language appears straightforward initially. Your device cannot block your view of the roadway, traffic signals, or pedestrians. Sensible, correct? The difficulty is how rigorously that's currently being applied. In states like California, Arizona, and Florida, positioning your phone in the middle of your windshield, even if it's placed just underneath your rearview mirror, is currently deemed an infraction. That positioning, which millions of motorists have utilized for years, is currently formally categorized as blocking your forward visual range. The only reliably acceptable areas, the lower right section of your windshield or directly upon the dashboard. Anywhere else begins to enter an ambiguous territory that enforcement is no longer regarding as ambiguous. And this isn't merely about getting stopped. The genuine repercussions emerge after something goes awry. There was an incident in Phoenix where a motorist was struck from behind at a traffic signal. Entirely not their responsibility, but their phone was positioned in the middle of the windshield. When the insurance carriers examined the incident, that particular detail became part of the assessment. The reasoning was straightforward. The mount positioning violated revised state standards, which suggested diminished situational awareness. The outcome, their settlement was reduced by 40%. A minor arrangement choice transformed into thousands of dollars forfeited. That's the transformation occurring here. These regulations aren't merely enforced on the roadway. They're being utilized after the incident to establish liability, accountability, and how much coverage you genuinely receive. So, even if you believe you're protected because you're hands-free, the inquiry now becomes, are you situated lawfully? Because if not, you're vulnerable in methods most motorists haven't even contemplated yet. And that identical trend where a regulation extends beyond what individuals anticipate is precisely what's occurring with the subsequent regulation, except this occasion it's not within your vehicle. It's what you do when you travel past someone else on the roadway. You already understand you're expected to shift lanes for police vehicles, ambulances, and emergency automobiles stationed on the shoulder. That's been customary for years. But as of January 2026, that regulation has broadened considerably. What's currently being designated the all-vehicle shift-over regulation has effectively become nationwide, and it pertains to far more circumstances than most motorists comprehend. If you observe any automobile on the shoulder with warning lights activated, whether it's a stranded motorist, a towing vehicle, a delivery truck, or someone replacing a tire, you are currently legally obligated to either vacate the nearest lane or considerably decrease your velocity. And not merely a minor reduction. In numerous states, the obligation is to decrease at least 20 mph below the designated speed limit if you cannot safely transition lanes. On paper, the objective is evident. Safeguard individuals who are exposed on the edge of the roadway. But in application, enforcement has become far more stringent than motorists anticipate. Enforcement vehicles are currently fitted with lateral-facing cameras that observe passing traffic, specifically searching for motorists who neglect to shift over or decelerate sufficiently, and the consequences demonstrate how critically this is being regarded. In certain jurisdictions, this isn't merely a traffic violation anymore. It's categorized as reckless endangerment. That signifies elevated penalties, points on your license, and in particular instances, compulsory court appearances. What renders this complicated is that not every circumstance provides you a straightforward opportunity to comply flawlessly. Dense traffic, narrow gaps, rapidly moving lanes. It's not invariably simple to shift over securely. But here's the essential element. Enforcement is frequently based on what your conduct appears like from the exterior. If you can't transition lanes, you need to demonstrate clearly that you're decelerating and acknowledging the circumstance. Because from an officer's viewpoint or a camera examining the recording afterward, it's not about what you plan to accomplish. It's about what it appeared you accomplished. And that transition from purpose to observable compliance is manifesting across numerous regulations this year, which leads us to the subsequent one, where even something as elementary as activating your wipers can quietly place you in violation if you're not considering one step forward. There's an instant most motorists don't even contemplate. Gentle rain begins descending, just sufficient to obscure the windshield slightly, so you switch your wipers on, perhaps once every several seconds. It feels insignificant, habitual, nearly instinctive. But in 2026, that minor action currently carries a legal obligation that's identifying thousands of motorists entirely by surprise. In 29 states, the regulation is currently definitive. If your windshield wipers are activated, your headlights must likewise be activated. No exceptions for time of day, no exceptions for gentle precipitation, no exceptions for periodic use. Wipers activated means headlights activated, conclusively. And the enforcement isn't merely originating from officers stationed on the roadside. In multiple states, traffic cameras and automated frameworks can currently detect this discrepancy. They can recognize the motion of your wipers and contrast it to your illumination status. If your headlights aren't completely engaged, including your rear lights, you can receive a citation in the mail days afterward, complete with photographic proof. That's what renders this so simple to overlook. You don't get detained. There's no advisory. It merely appears. And here's where numerous motorists commit a crucial error. They presume their daytime running lights qualify. They don't. Daytime running lights characteristically only illuminate the front of your automobile at decreased brightness. This regulation mandates full headlight engagement, which encompasses your rear lights additionally. If your tail lights aren't activated, you're still in violation, even if the front of your automobile appears illuminated. The penalties might appear comparatively modest relative to some of the other regulations, typically between $75 and $200, but that's not the genuine concern. The genuine concern is how effortlessly this can transpire without you recognizing it. A rapid activation of the wipers, a brief journey in gentle rain, and you've already crossed the threshold. The most straightforward method to eliminate that hazard is to embed the practice. Wipers activated, headlights activated every occasion. No deliberation necessary. Because as you're beginning to observe, 2026 traffic regulations aren't merely about major errors. They're constructed around identifying minor routine behaviors that previously were innocuous. And once those minor infractions begin accumulating, the repercussions intensify much quicker than most individuals anticipate. Because currently, it's not merely about whether you receive a citation, it's about how those citations compound over time. And in multiple major states, the complete calculation underlying your driving record has been altered. Historically, most states monitored infractions over an 18-month duration. That provided motorists some flexibility. Previous violations would expire comparatively quickly, and minor errors didn't necessarily accompany you for extended periods. But as of February 2026, states like New York, Illinois, and Florida have formally extended that window to 24 months, which signifies every citation, every point, every infraction currently remains with you longer. But the duration is only portion of the transformation. The significance of those infractions has likewise escalated, and in certain instances considerably. Consider New York as an illustration. The benchmark for automatic license suspension has been reduced from 11 points to 10. Simultaneously, particular infractions have become substantially more costly in terms of points. Overtaking a halted school bus, which previously carried 5 points, can currently impact you with 8. Exceeding the limit in a construction zone, that's currently an automatic 8 points in certain regions, irrespective of how far beyond the restriction you traveled. And that connects to another significant modification occurring nationally: construction zone multipliers. In 38 states, any moving infraction that occurs in a designated construction zone currently carries double the points. Not double the penalty, double the consequence on your license. So something that would ordinarily assign you 2 points instantly becomes 4. 3 becomes 6, and it compounds rapidly. What surprises individuals is that these zones don't necessitate active laborers to be present. If the signage is displayed, the zone is operative. You could be traveling through late in the evening, no construction apparent, and still be subjected to the amplified consequences. That's where the hazard intensifies. 2 apparently insignificant errors distributed over 2 years can currently propel you beyond the suspension benchmark. Not elevated insurance, genuine forfeiture of your license. And once that transpires, the procedure of restoration becomes its own obstacle with fees, waiting durations, and sustained financial consequences. So the approach here isn't complex, but it is essential. Regard every construction zone as zero tolerance, and presume every point you accumulate will accompany you longer than it previously did. Because in 2026, the framework isn't merely monitoring what you accomplish. It's retaining it, assigning it greater significance, and utilizing it to render much more consequential determinations about your capacity to remain on the roadway. There's a minor item suspended in millions of automobiles presently that most motorists don't consider twice about. It could be an air freshener, a parking permit, a decorative item, something meaningful, something that's existed there for years without ever creating an issue. But in 2026, that identical item can currently be the justification you get detained. 14 states have formally implemented more rigid rearview mirror obstruction regulations, and the stipulation is as straightforward as it is inflexible. If anything is suspended from your mirror and it's noticeable to an officer, it can be regarded as a violation. No exceptions for dimensions, no exceptions for purpose. And while the penalty itself might appear negligible, typically somewhere between $50 and $150, that's not where the genuine hazard originates. The genuine concern is what that infraction permits. It provides law enforcement justifiable cause to commence a traffic stop. And once that stop occurs, everything else becomes relevant. Your license, your registration, your automobile condition, anything else that might result in supplementary citations or difficulties. That's why this regulation is receiving scrutiny, not because of the consequence independently, but because of what it enables. And what's surprising individuals is how commonplace these items feel. Dealership identifiers, religious emblems, even lightweight air fresheners. Items that never appeared problematic previously are currently being regarded as valid justifications to detain someone. So, the most secure decision here is uncomplicated. If it suspends from your mirror, remove it. Because in the present enforcement climate, Even the most minimal detail can become the inception point for something considerably larger. And that notion that minor modifications can produce much greater repercussions becomes even more tangible when you examine how 2026 is influencing not merely how we operate, but who is permitted to continue operating in the first instance. One of the most contested revisions this year focuses on motorists above the age of 65. Multiple states have commenced deploying compulsory cognitive evaluation as part of the license renewal procedure. What previously was a straightforward vision examination is currently being brought in to incorporate digital evaluations that gauge reaction time, spatial perception, and decision-making velocity. Beyond that, revised physician reporting obligations in particular regions signify that doctors are currently required to inform the DMV if they detect indicators of cognitive deterioration that could affect driving capability. The objective is safety, but the ramifications are profoundly personal. For numerous individuals, operating represents autonomy, and currently that autonomy is linked to satisfying a more elaborate and continuous assessment procedure. Concurrently, another obligation is surfacing in states that encounter more severe weather circumstances. Compulsory tire tread evaluations connected directly to automobile registration. In locations like Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Alaska, and Minnesota, motorists must currently satisfy a minimum tread depth of 4/32 of an inch, double the preceding federal standard. If your tires don't satisfy that obligation, your registration renewal is rejected until they're substituted. No postponements, no provisional endorsements. And that generates a financial strain point. Because if you arrive anticipating a standard renewal and fail evaluation, you're abruptly confronting the immediate expense of a complete tire substitution merely to remain lawfully on the roadway. These modifications might influence different demographics in different manners, but they all indicate the identical fundamental transformation. Operating in 2026 is no longer merely about how you conduct yourself behind the wheel. It's about satisfying an expanding collection of prerequisites, physical, mechanical, and regulatory, that establish whether you're permitted to be there whatsoever. And before we continue further, here's something to remember. Most motorists are going to get identified by at least one of these modifications simply because they don't understand they exist yet, but currently you do. And that consciousness is what distinguishes someone who gets caught unaware from someone who remains ahead of it. If you want to remain current with how these regulations are developing, because they are transforming rapidly, make sure you're following US visa and green card info. Because what's approaching next progresses beyond minor penalties and insignificant stops into regulations that are already producing serious financial harm, legal complications, and in certain instances, criminal accusations. Currently, we enter the portion of this countdown where the repercussions cease being inconvenient and commence becoming grave. Because regulation number 3 isn't merely identifying individuals by surprise. It's converting ordinary motorists into criminal proceedings over something most of them don't even comprehend is a concern, and it entirely centers on your license plate. In 2026, numerous states have reclassified any variety of license plate obstruction as a considerably more severe violation. And when we reference obstruction, we're not merely discussing someone intentionally attempting to conceal their plate. The designation currently encompasses anything that disrupts how a camera interprets it. Covers, borders, coatings, even entirely transparent shields. The premise embedded in the regulation is uncomplicated. If it influences readability to a sensor, it's an infraction. And in states like Texas, Virginia, New York, Colorado, Washington, Illinois, Georgia, and Michigan, that infraction can currently intensify far beyond a citation. In certain jurisdictions, it's being classified as a felony-level violation, particularly if there's any indication that the obstruction could be employed to circumvent tolls or automated enforcement. That signifies potential court proceedings, thousands in penalties, and in severe instances, a lasting notation on your record. What's rendering this so prevalent is how commonplace these items are. Dealership borders that partially obscure the state designation. Ornamental borders that marginally overlap registration decals, transparent plastic shields that individuals installed merely to safeguard against grime or elements. For years, these were standard. Currently, they're vulnerabilities. There was an instance where a motorist purchased a pre-owned automobile that arrived with a slightly darkened plate shield already mounted. They didn't consider it twice until they were detained. What ensued wasn't merely a citation, but a legal predicament that necessitated legal counsel, cost thousands in expenses, and could have intensified further depending on how purpose was construed. And that's the crucial term here, purpose. Even if you didn't mount it, even if you weren't aware, enforcement doesn't invariably conclude at the apparent level. If it resembles something that could disrupt automated frameworks, it becomes your accountability, and enforcement is accelerating rapidly. Officers are being instructed to specifically examine for anything that prevents a license plate from being flawlessly legible, not merely to the human eye, but to electronic frameworks. In certain instances, automobiles have even been designated for impoundment if the plate isn't completely compliant. That's how assertive this has become. So, the most secure and genuinely the only decision here is complete transparency. No shields, no borders, no additions, merely the plate precisely as dispensed, because this is the regulation that's identifying the most individuals currently, and it's accomplishing it without notification. And if that appears intrusive, the subsequent regulation advances it further, not by altering what's on your automobile, but by monitoring whether you're even authorized to be operating it in real time. The allowance period for insurance interruptions is effectively eliminated. In 2026, multiple states have completely merged their DMV frameworks with insurance carriers, establishing a live linkage that refreshes instantaneously. The instant your policy terminates, is discontinued, or even temporarily lapses due to a missed installment, that data is conveyed directly into a statewide repository. And from that point, it becomes accessible to enforcement frameworks nearly immediately. Enforcement automobiles, highway detectors, and stationary plate scanners can currently identify uninsured automobiles as they travel past. No traffic stop necessary to uncover it. Your standing is already established before you're even detained. And if you are detained, the repercussions have intensified. In numerous states, operating without current insurance is no longer regarded as a rectifiable matter. Officers currently possess the power to impound the automobile immediately because it's categorized as an active hazard on the roadway. But the more profound transformation isn't merely about whether you possess insurance. It's about how your operating conduct is currently connected to it. Contemporary automobiles arrive equipped with event data recorders, frequently designated as black boxes. These frameworks monitor elements like braking tendencies, acceleration, cornering, and velocity fluctuations. Under revised 2026 guidelines, insurance carriers are progressively authorized to access a version of that information or a condensed safety rating when assessing your policy. And here's where it becomes a compromise most motorists don't comprehend they're accepting. If you consent to share that information, your rates may correspond to your operating patterns. But if you elect not to, if you decline for privacy considerations, certain insurers currently position you into a higher hazard classification by default, not because of what you accomplished, but because of what you elected not to disclose. So the framework transforms again. You're not merely being assessed by what transpires on the roadway. You're being assessed by what your automobile communicates behind the scenes. And that signifies the characterization of safe operating is no longer merely observable conduct. It's information, perpetual, quiet, and progressively consequential. And currently we arrive at the most substantial transformation of all, one that doesn't merely alter how regulations are implemented, but alters who or what is genuinely in command when you're behind the wheel. Commencing with 2026 model automobiles, a revised federal requirement mandates sophisticated impaired operation detection frameworks to be incorporated directly into the vehicle. You may have encountered it referenced as a kill switch, but formally it's designated as passive monitoring technology. And the manner it functions is far more comprehensive than most individuals comprehend. Within the automobile, sensors and cameras perpetually monitor operator conduct. That encompasses eye movement, head positioning, steering tendencies, lane regularity, nuanced indicators that the framework utilizes to establish whether you might be impaired. On paper, the objective is evident. Diminish collisions caused by intoxication or exhaustion. But here's where it transforms the operating experience completely. If the framework establishes that your conduct exceeds a particular benchmark, it doesn't merely notify you. It can actively restrict or prevent the automobile from functioning. In other terms, the vehicle can determine you're unfit to operate and respond to that determination. Currently, incorporate another dimension to that. In particular states, law enforcement has commenced merging with automobile frameworks and methods that permit remote intervention during elevated risk circumstances like pursuits, which signifies the notion of command is no longer restricted to the individual in the operator's position. It's distributed between software sensors and, in certain instances, external jurisdiction. And while this technology is being presented as a safety advancement, it generates a question that more motorists are beginning to pose. What transpires when the framework makes an error? Because false positives are conceivable. Exhaustion after an extended day, irritation in your vision, momentary deviation to circumvent debris. These are ordinary human behaviors, but to an algorithm, they can resemble impairment. And once the framework reacts, you're no longer rendering the determination. You're responding to one that's already been rendered for you. That's the trajectory operating is following. Not merely regulated, but surveilled. Not merely watched, but analyzed in real time by frameworks you don't directly command. And whether that seems like advancement or excessive reach depends on where you're positioned. But regardless, it's already present. So when you step back and examine everything we've just addressed, a pattern becomes apparent. This isn't about one or two regulation adjustments. It's a thorough transformation in how operating is characterized, surveilled, and implemented. From the instant you reach an intersection to how your automobile monitors your conduct behind the scenes, the tolerance for mistakes has contracted across the board. And the motorists getting impacted the most severely aren't the careless ones. They're the ones who simply haven't adapted yet. So, here's what genuinely matters progressing forward. Commence with the most consequential modifications. Ensure your license plate is entirely unobstructed. No shields, no borders, nothing that could disrupt visibility. Relocate your phone mount to a lawfully sanctioned position, preferably upon the dashboard or lower right windshield. Establish the practice that if your wipers are activated, your headlights are activated every single occasion. Remove anything suspended from your rearview mirror. Verify your insurance standing and configure automatic installments so there's no possibility of a lapse. Regard construction zones gravely, even when they appear dormant. And if your automobile has information sharing configurations, access that framework and comprehend exactly what's being monitored and what alternatives you possess. These aren't elaborate modifications, but they are vital ones because the actuality is these regulations are already operative. They're already being implemented, and not comprehending them won't safeguard you. What will safeguard you is remaining ahead of them, adapting promptly, and comprehending how the framework genuinely functions currently, not how it previously did. That's the distinction between someone who discovers the difficult way and someone who never has to. Stay informed with US Visa and Green Card info for the latest updates.